Between 1936 and 1938, the Soviet Union executed approximately 680,000 of its own citizens for political crimes. An additional 1.2 million were sent to forced labor camps, where hundreds of thousands more would die. These weren't foreign enemies or wartime casualties. They were Communist Party members, military officers, factory workers, teachers, and ordinary Soviet citizens. According to official Soviet archives declassified after 1991, 81 of 103 Soviet generals and admirals were executed during this period. Over half of the officers who held general-grade military ranks by the end of 1936 were repressed, and at least 780 were executed. This purge of military leadership would prove catastrophic when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. This is the documented history of Stalin's Great Purge, how the Soviet state systematically destroyed its own elite, and why the Communist Party orchestrated mass repression against its own members. To understand how the Great Purge became possible, you need to examine the political landscape of the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, the specific circumstances that enabled Stalin to launch such an extensive campaign of terror. By 1934, Joseph Stalin had been General Secretary of the Communist Party for over a decade. Following Vladimir Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin had systematically outmaneuvered his rivals, most notably Leon Trotsky, whom he expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929. However, Stalin's position, while dominant, was not entirely secure. At the 17th Party Congress in February 1934, something revealing happened. Stalin received 267 negative votes in the election to the Politburo, the most of any candidate. Sergei Kirov received only 3 negative votes, the fewest of any candidate. This vote revealed significant dissatisfaction within the party. Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture had resulted in widespread famine, killing millions. His rapid industrialization program had created chaos in Soviet industry. Party members who had participated in the 1917 revolution, the so-called Old Bolsheviks, increasingly questioned whether Stalin's methods aligned with revolutionary ideals. The institutional structure of Soviet power complicated Stalin's control. The Communist Party, in theory, operated through collective decision-making in the Politburo. The secret police, reorganized in 1934 as the NKVD, answered nominally to the party leadership, not to Stalin personally. The military maintained its own institutional culture and chains of command. For an increasingly paranoid Stalin, these independent power centers represented potential threats. Historical evidence suggests Stalin believed, or chose to believe, that opposition within the party was not merely political disagreement, but active conspiracy. In 1932, the Politburo had refused to execute Martemyan Ryutin, an old Bolshevik who had distributed a pamphlet calling for Stalin's removal. In 1933, they again refused to approve the execution of A.P. Smirnov, a party member since 1996 who had been agitating for Stalin's removal. To Stalin, the Politburo's resistance to executing his critics signaled dangerous leniency. The mechanism Stalin would use to launch his purge arrived on December 1, 1934. Sergei Kirov, head of the Leningrad Communist Party organization and full member of the Politburo, was shot and killed by Leonid Nikolaev outside his office in the Smolny Institute. Nikolaev and several alleged accomplices were convicted in a show trial and executed less than 30 days later. The Kirov assassination remains one of the most contested events in Soviet history. Nikita Khrushchev, in his famous 1956 secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes, strongly implied that Stalin himself engineered Kirov's assassination. Whether Stalin was directly involved or not, he acted quickly and in such a sweeping manner that suggests either he participated in the plot or that he had been planning some form of political repression before December 1, 1934. Regardless of Stalin's involvement in Kirov's death, what is documented beyond dispute is how he used it. Stalin claimed to have discovered a widespread conspiracy of anti-Stalinist communists who were planning to assassinate the entire Soviet leadership. Within weeks, hundreds of Leningrad citizens were executed, and thousands more were sent to forced labor camps for their alleged complicity in the plot. The Great Purge had begun. The first major show trial opened in August 1936, while Genrikh Yagoda served as chief of the NKVD. 16 defendants, including Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, two of the most prominent former party leaders who had been members of the original Bolshevik leadership, were accused of forming a Trotskyite, Kamenevist, Zinoviev leftist counter-revolutionary bloc. The charges were sweeping and dramatic. The accused were accused of plotting to assassinate Stalin and other Soviet leaders, of working with Trotsky to sabotage Soviet industry, of conspiring with foreign powers to restore capitalism. The evidence presented consisted entirely of confessions by the defendants themselves. The confessions followed a pattern that would become familiar in subsequent trials. All the evidence presented in court was derived from preliminary examinations of the defendants and from their confessions. It was subsequently established that the accused were innocent, that the cases were fabricated by the secret police, and that the confessions were made under pressure of intensive torture and intimidation. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had been Lenin's closest collaborators during the revolution, stood in a Moscow courtroom and confessed to being foreign agents and terrorists. The proceedings were broadcast on radio and reported extensively in Soviet newspapers. On August 24, 1936, all 16 defendants were found guilty and executed by firing squad. The trial served multiple purposes for Stalin. It eliminated two of his most prominent potential rivals. It established a precedent for extracting confessions from high-ranking party members. And it created a narrative, a vast conspiracy to destroy the Soviet Union from within that would justify increasingly extreme measures. In September 1936, Stalin replaced NKVD chief Genrikh Yagoda with Nikolai Yezhov. This transition marked the beginning of the purge's most intensive phase, known in Russian as the Yezhovshchina, the time of Yezhov. Yezhov was a dedicated Stalinist who understood exactly what was required. Under his leadership, the NKVD transformed from a secret police force into an instrument of mass terror operating on an industrial scale. The campaigns were carried out according to the general line of the party, often by direct orders from the Politburo headed by Stalin. The language Stalin used in these directives is revealing. Stalin used terms like fifth column, enemy of the people, and saboteurs to describe those targeted during the Great Purge. In January 1937, the second major Moscow trial began. The major defendants were G. L. Pyatakov, G. Y. Sokolnikov, L. P. Serebryakov, and Karl Radek, all prominent figures in the Soviet regime, along with 17 co-defendants. They were accused of forming an anti-Soviet Trotskyite center that had allegedly collaborated with Trotsky to conduct sabotage and terrorist activities designed to ruin the Soviet economy and reduce defensive capability. The Dewey Commission, established in the United States by Trotsky's supporters to examine the charges, brought to light evidence that established that some of the charges made at the trials could not be true. For example, Georgy Pyatakov testified that he had flown to Oslo in December 1935 to receive terrorist instructions from Trotsky. The Dewey Commission established that no such flight took place. Another defendant, Ivan Smirnov, admitted taking part in the assassination of Sergei Kirov in December 1934, when Smirnov had been in prison for a year. The confessions were physically impossible. Yet the trials proceeded. On January 30th, 1937, most defendants were executed. A few received 10-year sentences, effectively death sentences in the Gulag system.
While the show trials proceeded in Moscow, an even more devastating purge targeted the Soviet armed forces. A series of closed trials of top Soviet military leaders was held in 1937 to 38, accompanied by a massive purge throughout the Soviet armed forces. The military purge began in June 1937 with the arrest and secret trial of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, Deputy People's Commissar for Defense and one of the most innovative military minds in the Soviet Union. Tukhachevsky and 7 other senior officers were accused of spying for Germany and Japan, of plotting a military coup against Stalin, and of sabotaging Soviet defense capabilities. The trial was held in secret. All 8 defendants were convicted and executed the same day. The scale of the military purge was staggering. Stalin had 30,000 members of the Red Army executed. In less than 2 years, over 1/2 of the 1,844 Soviet Army officers who held general-grade military ranks by the end of 1936 were repressed, and at least 780 were executed, including 3 of the country's 5 highest-ranked officers. The purge extended beyond the highest ranks. Research examining patterns of repression among the Soviet High Command found that the probability of being repressed was higher for certain ethnic minorities, higher ranks, and those with prior foreign contacts. Latvians, Poles, and other ethnic minorities in the military faced particularly harsh targeting. Perhaps most revealing, controlling for other characteristics, including military rank and party history, the probability of repression was much higher for younger cadres. Stalin wasn't just removing potential conspirators, he was specifically eliminating the most competent officers. Stalin's liquidation of experienced military leadership during this purge was one of the major factors contributing to the poor performance of Soviet forces in the initial phase of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. While the Moscow trials captured international attention, they represented only a small fraction of the purge's actual scope. Outside the spotlight, the NKVD conducted what it called mass operations, targeting specific categories of Soviet citizens. Documents now housed in the Hoover Institution archives, acquired through a joint microfilming project with the Russian State Archive, provide direct evidence of the extent and nature of Stalin's terror. Top-secret Politburo resolutions show Stalin and his colleagues consigning tens of thousands to execution and slow death. A July 10, 1937 Politburo meeting resolution confirmed 1,881 kulaks selected to be shot and 4,259 for exile. A later resolution on the same day selected an additional 14,000 for execution and nearly 31,000 for exile. The NKVD targeted certain ethnic minorities with particular force, including Volga Germans and Soviet citizens of Polish origin, who were subjected to forced deportation and extreme repression. An NKVD order listing suspicious groups of people includes those born in border zones. A countrywide order to start a Latvian operation was issued by Yezhov on November 30, 1937, targeting political immigrants, Latvian nationals, members of ethnic clubs, and other groups. According to figures, 21,300 people were convicted throughout the country. The terror extended to virtually every segment of Soviet society. Millions of people died unnatural deaths in the Soviet Union during the 1930s. The vast majority of those executed in the Great Purge were not famous but rather ordinary Soviet citizens, workers, peasants, homemakers, teachers, priests, musicians, pensioners, ballerinas, beggars. The NKVD operated through three-person committees called troikas that could arrest, try, convict, and execute people within hours with no right of appeal. Quotas for arrests and executions were sent from Moscow to regional NKVD offices. Local officials who failed to meet their quotas faced arrest themselves. Throughout the purge, the NKVD sought to strengthen control over civilians through fear and frequently used imprisonment, torture, violent interrogation, and executions during its mass operations. The third trial and the purge consumes itself. In March 1938, the third and final Moscow trial began. The prosecution suggested that the Zinoviev-Trotsky conspiracy also included Nikolai Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, and Genrikh Yagoda, the former NKVD chief who had conducted the first purge trials. Bukharin had been one of Lenin's closest collaborators and the leading theorist of the Communist Party. He was accused of having plotted to murder Lenin in 1918, a charge so absurd it demonstrated how completely detached from reality the trials had become. Although one defendant, N. Krestinsky, retracted his guilty plea, and Bukharin and Yagoda skillfully responded to prosecutor Andrei Vyshinsky's questions to demonstrate their innocence, all the defendants except three were sentenced to death on March 13, 1938. The trial of Yagoda, the man who had organized the first purge trials, illustrated a crucial pattern. The purge consumed those who carried it out. NKVD officers who conducted interrogations and executions found themselves arrested months later. Prosecutors who obtained confessions themselves were forced to confess. The machinery of terror made no distinction between those who operated it and those it targeted. Nikolai Yezhov himself would fall victim to this pattern. In the summer of 1938, Yezhov was relieved from his post as head of the NKVD and eventually tried and executed. Lavrenti Beria succeeded him. On November 17, 1938, a joint decree by the Council of People's Commissars and the Communist Party Central Committee canceled most of the NKVD orders of systematic repression and suspended the implementation of death sentences. The Great Purge was officially over. The damage was catastrophic. The statistical documentation of the Great Purge, made available after the Soviet Union's collapse, reveals the scope of the terror with grim precision. According to official figures, there were 777,975 judicial executions for political charges from 1929 to 1953, including 681,692 in 1937 to 1938, the years of the Great Purge. Unofficial estimates place the total number of Stalinism repression deaths in 1937 to 1938 at 700,000 to 1,200,000. Soviet archives document approximately 1.5 to 1.7 million deaths in the Gulag system, around 390,000 deaths during dekulakization forced resettlement, and up to 400,000 deaths of persons deported during the 1940s, with a total of about 3.3 million officially recorded victims. According to historian Stephen Wheatcraft, approximately 1 million of these deaths were purposive, while the rest happened through neglect and irresponsibility. However, some historians believe that the official archival figures are unreliable and incomplete. Canadian historian Robert Gelati and Simon Sebag Montefiore argue that many suspects beaten and tortured to death while in investigatory custody were likely not counted among the executed. The institutional devastation.
The purge's impact on Soviet institutions was devastating. The Communist Party lost approximately 850,000 members between 1936 and 1938, 36% of its membership. Old Bolsheviks who had been party members in 1917 were especially targeted. Nearly the entire generation that had made the revolution was eliminated. The cultural impact was equally severe. Soviet linguist Nikolai Nevsky, an expert in East Asian languages, was arrested by the NKVD on charges of being a Japanese spy. He and his Japanese wife were executed on November 27, 1937. Ukrainian drama writer Mykola Kulish, a leading figure in what became known as the Executed Renaissance, was executed on November 3, 1937. After sunspot development research was judged un-Marxist, 27 astronomers disappeared between 1936 and 1938. The Meteorology Office was purged as early as 1933 for failing to predict weather harmful to crops. The terror operated according to a perverse logic.
While reading an execution list, Stalin once said, "Who's going to remember all this riffraff in 10 or 20 years' time?" His assumption was that history would forget. He was wrong. What drove Stalin to launch such extensive repression remains debated by historians. Overall findings confirm that Stalin was not reacting to any imminent conspiracy threat, but rather sought to preemptively minimize the risk of a possible coup. The purge eliminated anyone who might potentially challenge Stalin's power, regardless of whether they actually posed a threat. Stalin's identity was so closely linked to the USSR that he considered an enemy of the state to be his own personal enemy, deserving of the most brutal punishment. This conflation of personal paranoia with state policy created conditions where political disagreement became criminalized and potential opposition became punishable by death. Stalin also signed a decree that made families liable for the crimes committed by a husband or father, extending the terror to relatives of those arrested, creating a climate where entire families could be destroyed for one person's alleged transgression. The Great Purge demonstrated how totalitarian systems can turn on themselves, consuming the very institutions and people necessary for their functioning. It was political terror as policy, paranoia systematized into state practice. The immediate aftermath of the Great Purge revealed its cost in ways Stalin had not anticipated. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the Red Army's performance in the initial months was catastrophic. The purge of military leadership had created a competence crisis. Junior officers who had been rapidly promoted to replace executed superiors lacked experience. Innovative military doctrines developed by Tukhachevsky and others had been abandoned as politically suspect. The first year of the war saw millions of Soviet soldiers killed or captured. Although the Great Purge officially ended in 1938, mass murders, arrests, and exiles continued until Stalin's death in 1953. The pattern of political repression Stalin established during 1936 to 1938 would remain a feature of Soviet governance for the rest of his rule. Even during World War II, Stalin continued to see enemies everywhere, ordering ethnic deportations and executing returning prisoners of war suspected of collaboration. The psychological impact on Soviet society was profound and lasting. An entire generation learned that political engagement was dangerous, that standing out invited destruction, and that survival required absolute conformity. The purge created what historians call an atomized society, individuals isolated from one another, unable to trust even family members since denunciation could come from anywhere. For decades, the full extent of the purge remained hidden.
Soviet authorities continued denying the scale of repression, maintaining the fiction that those executed had genuinely been spies and traitors. It wasn't until Nikita Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech to the 20th Party Congress that the Soviet leadership officially acknowledged Stalin's crimes. Khrushchev condemned the cruel violence of the Great Terror, calling the purges an abuse of power and acknowledging that many of the victims were in fact innocent. However, even Khrushchev's denunciation had limits. He focused on crimes against party members, not on the much larger number of ordinary Soviet citizens who had been terrorized and killed. The archives open. The full documentary record only became accessible after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The opening of Soviet archives allowed historians to reconstruct the purge's mechanisms and scope with unprecedented detail. The evidence confirmed what survivors had long maintained. The purge was not a reaction to genuine conspiracies, but a deliberate campaign to eliminate any potential opposition to Stalin's rule. Memorial organizations in Russia and former Soviet states have worked to document victims' names and experiences, creating databases and monuments to those who died. This process of historical reckoning remains incomplete and politically contentious. Recent Russian government policies have restricted access to some archives and limited discussions of Stalin-era repressions, reflecting ongoing debates about how to remember this period. The Great Purge stands as a stark example of how political systems can employ state terror on their own populations. Understanding its mechanisms and consequences remains relevant for analyzing authoritarian governance and political repression in any era. The Great Purge reveals fundamental dynamics of totalitarian systems. Political paranoia, when combined with absolute power and institutions willing to execute any order, can generate self-destructive cycles of repression. Stalin's purge eliminated the very people, experienced military officers, competent administrators, skilled technicians, whose expertise the Soviet state needed to function effectively. The historical significance extends beyond the Soviet context. The purge demonstrated that mass political violence need not be spontaneous or chaotic. It can be bureaucratized, systematized, and executed through administrative procedures that give it an appearance of legality. The troika system, the show trials, the forced confessions, all created of the veneer of judicial process over what was fundamentally state murder. Recent research continues to refine our understanding of the purge's causes, mechanisms, and consequences. Historians debate the extent of Stalin's personal involvement versus institutional dynamics, the relative importance of ideological versus pragmatic motivations, and the long-term impact on Soviet political culture. What remains undebatable is the human cost. Hundreds of thousands executed, millions imprisoned, families destroyed, an entire generation of revolutionary leaders eliminated. The psychological scarring of a society taught that survival required silence and conformity. The mechanisms Stalin employed, creating categories of political enemies, using confession-based trials, implementing quotas for arrests, appear in various forms throughout 20th century history. Understanding the Great Purge provides insight into how political systems can systematically terrorize their own populations. If you want to understand how Stalin rose to absolute power and created the system that made the purge possible, the next video examines his consolidation of control following Lenin's death, the political maneuvering, institutional changes, and elimination of rivals that transformed the Soviet Union into a personal dictatorship. That story begins in 1924 with Lenin's death and the power struggle that would consume the Bolshevik Party.